Hello, everybody out there. My name is Kent McIntosh. I'm from the University of Oregon and representing the OSEP National Technical Assistance Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. I have the great privilege of getting the opportunity to lead the disproportionality work group for the PBIS Center. It's got a lot of people who have contributed a great deal to the free resources and the guidance that we've been able to put out to schools on the PBIS.org website. And I wanted to call out Mulaney Leverson, Kent Smith, Jen Rose, and also Sarah Pinkelman for the work that they've been doing on the materials that I'm going to be sharing with you all today. And to get you all going, what I wanted to do was start with a little bit of a question. So you can actually just type right into the chat box below, what are some things that you want to get out of the session? You should have up on the screen a little window that's popped up for you. All right, so I'm starting to see some answers here. Thank you. How others are addressing equity within MTSS, what teachers can do in their classrooms, how to start the conversation or broach the subject. So I'm assuming what you're describing is working with staff on building commitment to address equity, which is a really important piece that is really key. So talking with staff, supporting staff, lots of good staff answers here. I'll tell you just to shape some of your answers here. I'm going to assume that you all are already, this is the group that's sitting here, are already pretty aware of the extent of discipline disproportionality out there. I'm going to assume that you're committed and are very interested in taking some steps to address equity. And so what we're going to do today in this session for this hour is talk about specific strategies that we're going to use. So like I said, I'm making that assumption that you already are aware, you already have an understanding of the problem, and you're ready to move towards some technical change to move towards solution. All right, so thank you for participating there. Given that, what we've tried to do at the center is be able to provide those specific strategies for dealing with increasing commitment from teachers and staff, but primarily for strategies for what educators, teachers can do in the classroom. So what I'd like you to do, if you haven't been there yet, is go on to the equity page, pbis.org/school/equity-PBIS. And what you'll find is our 5-point intervention approach for addressing equity in school discipline. You've probably heard the saying that for every complex problem, there is a simple solution that won't work. And that's what we've got here. So there is not going to be one silver bullet that's going to fix everything. Instead, what we're going to see is people trying a lot of different things. And what we've come up with from the center, from the disproportionality work group, is our 5 best bets for enhancing equity. Now, what that means is there are going to be some things on here that are things you're already doing. There are going to be some things that you might look at and say, oh, we're not totally sure about that. And there are going to be some things that you're doing that you're feeling are really working, but are not on our list. And if you've got something that you're doing that's working, by all means, don't stop doing it. But these are our 5 best bets from the research and from our experiences working with schools and districts. So here are 5 points. Number one is using engaging academic instruction, and we've got an academic instruction brief to help guide you through that process. Number two is implement a behavior framework that is instructional in nature, is multi-tiered so that there's a continuum of support provided, and is flexible enough to address the needs of students, families, community, and your staff as well. So most of you are thinking about implementing this through your PBIS systems. Number three is look at disaggregated discipline data. Don't assume that just because your achievement is going up or your exclusionary discipline rates are going down, that that's true for each student group. Sometimes overall changes tend to mask lack of change or even things getting worse for some of our underrepresented groups. Number four is policy work. And then number five is teaching strategies to neutralize implicit bias. A webinar last year gave an overview of each of these, but what we're going to focus on today is this second one right here. How can we build systems to prevent challenges to meet students' needs right in the first place? So like I said before, what we want to do is focus on implementing through a framework as opposed to just trying and picking and choosing little things. We can pick and choose little things, and I'm actually going to show you a lot of little things to pick and choose throughout. But I think what the key part is that you've got an overall system that you're implementing and a framework that can most effectively enhance equity in school discipline. So here's some reasons why we might use PBIS as that framework. Number one is if we actually teach students what we expect of them, as opposed to assuming that they know everything, then we get to avoid the challenge that Anita Archer calls assume-icide. When we see unwanted behavior and assume that it's based on students being willfully disobedient, as opposed to just not knowing what we ask them, what we want them to do, because we never actually explicitly taught them how to do it. Number two, if we've got tools for improving student-teacher interactions, then we're going to enhance relationships. So what I think about that is, my view of it is that we've got, every student has a relationship bank account that we have with them. And anytime we've got positive or even neutral interactions with students or non-contingent attention, we're adding funds to that relationship bank account. And that's important because there are going to be some times when we are going to need to make a withdrawal on that bank account. And what we don't want is to step up to the ATM and make a withdrawal and get that slip back that says insufficient funds. Number three, if we clean up our referral and discipline procedures so that they're really clear, so that we reduce ambiguity in our discipline decisions, we are going to dramatically reduce the influence of implicit bias on those decisions. Ambiguity is disproportionality's best friend. And if our systems are unclear, if we're not entirely sure where to go, if there's lots of gray area and what we're supposed to do and when we're supposed to send a student to the office as opposed to handle in their classroom or with the student in the immediate setting, we're going to run into lots of trouble. And then number four, if we can provide our educators working with students, our instructional staff, with tools other than simply sending a student out of classroom, removing the student from the activity, sending the student home, then they're going to have a much better chance of teaching the students the skills that they need that got them into that situation in the first place. And they can't learn those skills when they're excluded from the classroom. They can't learn those skills when they're excluded from school. They can't learn those skills when they're out in the community. They need to be in school with us actually teaching them the basic skills that they need to be successful and meet their own human needs. All right. And we do have some research on effectiveness of PBIS on discipline disproportionality. So you're all probably very aware of effects of PBIS on exclusionary discipline in general. So reductions in office referrals, reductions in out-of-school suspensions, all of those through multiple randomized controlled trials show that. But there's also some evidence showing that PBIS reduces not just overall discipline, but the gap between white students and students of color. So let me give you a few examples of that. Claudia Vincent and colleagues did a study finding statistically significantly lower black-white office discipline referral disproportionality in schools implementing PBIS to criterion, meaning with fidelity of implementation, versus schools not. In another study of different schools, decreases in office referrals after implementation of PBIS are seen across racial ethnic groups, not just particularly for white students. We've got some case studies, for example, some of Terry Scott's earlier work showing larger decreases in exclusionary discipline for underrepresented students than, or underserved students than other students in the school. And these patterns also seen in indigenous-run schools as well. So all of that tells us a little bit to say PBIS does not necessarily solve discipline disproportionality on its own, but is an important vehicle or avenue or framework for implementing the additional strategies that we might need to do better. So my colleagues Terry Tobin and Claudia Vincent did a really interesting study where they looked at schools that had reduced the black-white discipline gap for suspensions, and then schools that hadn't. And they were looking at what were the parts of PBIS, what were the things that the adults in the building were doing, or what was the implementation that might be most related to decreasing that discipline gap. And they found two really strong predictors. One was regular use of data for decision making, particularly disaggregated discipline data, but also looking at fidelity of implementation data. And then number two was implementation of classroom PBIS systems, not just overall systems, but specifically for the classroom. Now, some of you might be familiar, one of the measures that they used for this study was the PBIS self-assessment survey. So you can find that on pbis.org, you can find it on pbisapps.org. And in there's 4 different systems for respondents to assess. So this would be school personnel to look at. There's school-wide, non-classroom, classroom, and individual. What I'm going to show you on the page right here is these are all 11 items of the critical features of classroom PBIS implementation. And so what you've got here is 3 of them that were most strongly related to decreased disproportionality, to reducing that suspensions discipline gap. All right, so think about it for yourself. If you're with somebody next to you, you can try to make some guesses. It might be a little bit of a surprise for you, but here we go. Number 1, expected behaviors acknowledged regularly. Number 2, transitions efficient and orderly. And then number 3, problem behaviors defined clearly. That's that second one up there. So one of the things that you end up seeing is, number 1, the larger the words are, the more stronger of a predictor they were. So expected behaviors acknowledged regularly cues us in that not only might there be a discipline gap, but there might also be an acknowledgement gap. That students are getting sent out of the classroom more, but they also might not have equitable access to our acknowledgement systems that we're using. Number 2, transitions efficient and orderly. When I look at that, I think about assume-aside. What are the things that we don't teach students that we assume that students know already? And then that second one there, problem behaviors defined clearly, thinking about ambiguity in our discipline systems. If we've got unclear definitions of what is a quote unquote problem behavior or what behaviors we don't want to see in the classroom, that's going to come right through in terms of equity. So the issue that we run into is if we don't attend to culture in the classroom and across the school, we run into a situation that looks like this. Here you see, here's a school. Welcome home of the dogs, but then here's the policy statement below it, no dogs. So are we giving mixed messages to some of our students by having systems that work for most students but don't engage all students? So here's the key, and this is what we're going to spend the rest of the time with, is this idea of cultural responsiveness. So I'm going to throw another poll up here, and I'd like you to just throw out, you don't have to do your dictionary definition, but what are a few words that you would use to define cultural responsiveness? Maybe it's some actions that you might do, maybe it's a couple key principles, something like that. Listening. Yeah, listening is a very key point in cultural responsiveness. Student-driven. Having empathy. Yeah, not just understanding, but actually feeling with students, and then the second step of compassion, of making some change. Perspective taking. Focus on the individual. Yeah, sometimes this is one of those things that's interesting about cultural responsiveness. Sometimes people think about cultural responsiveness in terms of thinking about groups of people, but one of the core parts about cultural responsiveness is responding to individual needs and watching out about accidentally increasing our stereotyping of groups in an attempt to be culturally responsive. Great, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you, I like this definition that the late Jeanette Klinger used for cultural responsiveness. It's got a few little parts to it that I think are really useful in thinking too, but I really like the answers that you all provided as well. She talks about three things. Number one is holding high expectations for all students. Number two, using students' cultures and experiences to enhance their learning. So not just understanding about it, not just tolerating, not just valuing, but actually taking their prior experience and connecting it to instruction to move them along. And then number three, providing all students with access to effective instruction and adequate resources for learning. You know, and I have to say that we've got systems in the U.S. educational system in terms of funding for schools that goes completely against number three right now. All right, so thinking about that question about high expectations, don't worry, this is not a poll. Should we lower our expectations for certain groups? So this is a little bit of a tendency that some of us might have to say, we really want students to be successful. Here are some students who are struggling, so I really want to get there and just praise and praise and praise. And so I'm going to accept, I'm going to have a lower bar for some students. And you've probably all figured out that that really is not the case. And so one of the things that I want to make sure that we do is not lower our expectations, because the greatest fear that we would have is that students won't actually meet those lower expectations and not do better than we would. So a better thing that we can do is to meet students where they are and give them the additional support that they need to meet the same goals. And I see, I'm glad people are adding information in the chat. Kim asked, can you give an example of how we fund inadequately? And Jessica provided a really nice example. One really basic one is if we fund schools through property taxes, then property taxes in some areas are going to have a whole lot more, and in neighborhoods where there are higher property taxes because the houses cost more, and some are not. Thank you for asking. Okay, so what I want to share with you is a little bit of a visual describing that idea of high and low expectations for students and a trap that we can run into. So, and I can share this from my teaching experience. I give a student an assignment, I think that they can do it, and the student comes in with something that is just not good, does not meet my expectations. So what I might do is I might provide some critical feedback about the things that they got wrong, the things that, that I think they can do better. And there's a chance, based on that student's learning history and based on the way that I provide it, and based on the student's experiences socially and in society, that the student might see that and say, hey, this person's got it out for me. This person is really, is really riding me extra hard. And so the student might very understandably respond with problem behavior or withdraw from that situation and withdraw from the classroom instruction. And my response to that is lowering standards and then withholding critical feedback next time so I don't get that kind of response. And the problem is that all of the other students have received critical feedback, and so the likelihood that they'll produce poor quality work in the future is even more. This can happen a different way too. Let's say the student produces poor quality work, and so what I do is I think I am going to be positive with students. This is not negative behavior support. And so I am going to be really, really, really up my praise, but what I end up doing is overpraising poor quality work. And students see, I don't need to tell you all, that students see through that dramatically and very quickly. And it's a pretty dangerous thing. If a student sees that we're offering insincere praise, or that we actually accurately think that their cruddy work is super amazing, they're going to think worse of us, and they're going to think worse of themselves, withdraw from schooling, don't get the critical feedback that they need, and not get that quality work. So what I'm going to describe to you, and we're going to start moving through a set of strategies, a bunch of little tips and tricks that we're going to do, and that I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share with you one of these right here, and it comes from researchers from a few different universities. And it's a term called wise feedback. So I'm going to share with you the study because it's I'll describe it really, really quickly, and then discuss how you can actually do this with interactions with students, right? You can coach others to do that. So in this study, middle and high school students were asked to write an essay, and then they turned those essays in, and they had the opportunity, if they wanted to turn in, to resubmit for more credit. And the teachers were asked to provide substantial criticism of what were the things that were problems that could get improved by these essays, and provided one of two notes at the end. Either, and they were randomly assigned, the teachers didn't know who was getting what, they were just pasted in there below. I'm giving you these comments because I have very high expectations and I know that you can reach them, or I'm giving you these comments so that you'll have feedback on your paper, a very descriptive statement. So here's what they saw, and I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly because I wanna get right through the strategies. But what you see for the, you've got white students on the left and African American students on the right. The dark shaded was the, and the y-axis is the percent of students who actually turned in the essay a second time after getting the feedback. So you see that 62% of students who received the dark bar as the descriptive feedback. And then the light bar, 87%, was the percent who revised when they got that wise feedback with the high standards. And you can see a much, much more powerful difference for African American students. 17% revised versus 72%. So when we think about how to do this, wise feedback from this study talked about three parts. One was critical feedback, Number 2 is communicating high standards for students. Not just you can do better, but you can meet a particular criterion, right? You can meet expectations. And then providing resources, meaning time and feedback for students' additional work. So, thinking about how to do this and thinking about making things quick and catchy, when I was thinking of something wise, I was thinking of an owl. So here's your owl over here. And what I wanted to do is think about, okay, how could we make this pretty memorable? So I'm going to share with you 2 kinds of owls. First is bad owl. So here's what bad owl does. Bad owl overpraises mediocre work, withholds constructive feedback, and has low expectations for underserved students. Okay, in contrast, here is good owl. So good owl offers critical feedback instead of withholding it, paired with high expectations, and then provides something called, at least that I call, a ladder statement. That means here's where I want you to be, and here is how I'm going to help you climb that ladder to get there. It's not just you can do better and you can do this great and go at it, but here's the additional resources and support that I'm going to provide for you. Okay. So what I'd like you to do, and the polls are going to pop up here, is for each one of these strategies, I'm going to share 5 or 6 or 7 strategies for you. I'd like you to share 2 things, or vote on 2 things. Number 1 is how likely would you be to try it? And then the second one is how likely do you think it would improve disciplinary equity? And instead of a scale of 1 to 10, we're doing a scale of 1 to 4, from very unlikely to very likely. So we're going to pop out first, so you should have the poll right there. The first one is how likely are you to do it, or how likely are you to recommend it for people? And we're going to do this quick, so please pop it up, provide your answer, and then we're going to move on to the next one. So if you haven't voted yet, give it a go real quick. Okay, so we got people leaning towards the very likely. We had a couple initial responders and the very unlikely. But about half people saying they'd be very likely to try it. Now let's switch to the next one, which is how likely do you think it would improve disciplinary equity? Same thing, from very unlikely to very likely. All right, so we got a lot of people moving on the likely or very likely point. And I think it's really, really nice to think about ways that we can provide the support that students need in a way that's going to work for them and that it's going to get heard. Okay, so let's move on to our next one. Thank you. So Mulaney Leverson, Kent Smith, Jen Rose, Sarah Pinkelman, and I put together some resources for cultural responsiveness. And you can see what we did is we fit them into these 5 different elements of cultural responsiveness in schools. Number 1 is identity awareness. Number 2 was, and so when I talk about identity awareness, I'm talking about staff identity, I'm talking about student identity, and I'm talking about community identity. For voice is increasing student voice and family and community voice in there. Number 3 is supportive environment. How do we change our systems? How do we change our school culture to make it more supportive of all students? Number 4 is situational appropriateness, and I'll talk about that. It's probably easier for me to give you examples than that. And then number 5 is use data for equity, which means disaggregating data. I probably won't get to that, but we've got a nice data guide online for that. All right. So to do all of this, there's a really nice free guide. It came out the very end of 2016, this Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. It's pretty big, and so this is not something that I would say, oh yeah, hand this to a team and they got it. It's a little bit more of a resource for trainers and coaches to be able to provide this information. We've got a section on identity awareness. I'll talk through that a little bit. We've got a second section, the TFI Cultural Responsiveness Companion that I'll describe in the next slide, and then a good chunk of appendices that include lesson plans, activities, examples, and so on. So that second part, which is one of the core parts of the field guide, is the TFI Cultural Responsiveness Companion. This one lines up with the tiered fidelity inventory, the fidelity of implementation tool from the PBIS Center that's the most recent, includes fidelity of implementation for all 3 tiers. And it has a section for each one of the items on the tier 1 scale of that tiered fidelity inventory. And so it lines up. There are 15 items for it. There are 15 items on the tier 1 scale. And I'll give you a little bit of an example. The screen is going to be really small, but you hopefully have already even downloaded it already, and you can take a look. But let me just give you a little bit of a taste of it. This one is for behavioral expectations. So you can see the TFI item is behavioral expectations. The PBIS big idea. We've got school-wide expectations that are brief, that are memorable, that are positively stated, that are aspirational, and we use those to teach social and emotional competencies. This cultural responsive elaboration is to ask yourself about how do we define those expectations? Do they actually match the values of the community? Do they match the values of families? Are the rules that we have defined based on a specific purpose for education, or is it just how we've always done it in school? So down below, you've got 2 columns. On the left is non-examples, and then on the right is examples. So non-examples might be if you think, you know, I'm doing it, I've actually got some good scores on the TFI, but the examples are how to really deepen the work. And then some resources, some activities, and some examples that you have. Great, you can see the arrow cruising around on the screen there. So here's what we would recommend for people to do to use this. Number 1 is start building a little bit of identity awareness. So I'll share an activity with you in just a little bit on that. Then complete the tiered fidelity inventory on its own and identify your areas of strength and priority that you would start feeding into your action plan for that. Then here's some ways that you might use the Cultural Responsiveness Companion. You might use it to build on the strengths that you've identified to say, let's go deeper in the things that we're already doing. You might say, if this is an area of priority, well, how would we enhance the responsiveness of it? You know, how can we implement it in the first place with attention to cultural responsiveness? Or if you're a true glutton for punishment, maybe you're going to complete the entire Cultural Responsiveness Companion right there. Then you take that and build it into your action plan. There's a built-in action plan in the field guide as well. So let's talk about that first one, identity awareness. So what I'm going to share with you is an activity that you can do with your staff. And that activity is something to build a little bit of self-awareness that might help guide that idea of what we define for our expectations or our specific examples of those expectations. This might be something that you do for 45 minutes during an early release or a late start day, or as part of a whole professional development day, or as we get started in the school year. I'm going to show you just a little bit of an example. What it's got here is some different elements of culture, and there are more on the field guide, but here are just a few that you could use. And then you can see the columns here. You fill out, everybody gets one of these, and remember this is for the adults in the building. Everybody gets my values growing up, fill in for there. What are my values now? Fill that in. What my school values, how my students and families might be different in terms of their values, and then how that difference in values might create conflict. So you might write in terms of appropriate personal space, you know, my values growing up was lots of hugging and touching, and now as an educator, now I really am focused on bubble space and being really clear with other people's space, and what my school values, I think we're all teaching the bubble space thing, so I think we're all pretty clear on that. But our students and families might come with much more touch involved. Or they might, I heard an example yesterday of somebody saying, you know, we were teaching bubble space at school, and a family member got a little bit upset because the student corrected their parent about using appropriate bubble space when they got in their face, and they had to handle that and talk about defining things differently at school and home. And so there was a conflict right there. So what you can do is complete this and then have people discuss their responses with each other, and then you can share some of those. So we won't do it right now, but what I am going to do is talk you through what some of the things that come through when I've done this activity with people. Number one is having those first two columns get people to show that values do change over time. There are not these one set of ways that values work and that's it. It gets you starting to think about how cultural conflict might happen because we've got different values and different things that we want to stress over values that are different from our families, that are not wrong, they're just different. And then the last one, that question is, how do we as a group identify what the school values are? Because whether we intentionally define our school values or not, we still have school values out there. And if we aren't intentional about it, then it's more likely going to default to what the majority of teaching staff in your schools grew up with. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and rate this one. Number one, rate, will you try it out? And then after that, how likely do you think it would work? Just a few more seconds on this one. Okay, likely is winning out on that one. All right, and moving on to the next one. How likely do you think this would actually improve equity? All right, likely is winning out on that one. Great, thank you for all the voting there. So that was one of the examples of how we might get staff to start talking about some of these issues without us coming in as administrators or trainers or coaches and kind of hitting them over the head with, here's what you ought to think, here's what you ought to do, here are the problems that we're having. Having people discuss it in a way that sort of, you know, you noticed that the rows that I had up at the top were a little bit more fun or funny or straightforward, and then you start moving down to the bottom, you might actually identify specific problems that you're having in your discipline data that are showing disparities, and then those ones might be a little touchier. All right, moving on. Next one is voice. I'm going to move through this one quickly because I think we've got a sense of voice, but I'm going to share with you one particular strategy or tool actually to improve both student voice and family voice. Many of you are familiar with the school climate surveys that have come up. Those went up on PBIS assessment last year, just at the end of last year, so roughly about a year ago. We also have a different set of surveys that we are testing out on our field testing site. So they don't show up in PBIS assessment, although you've got access if you're a PBIS coordinator and you're really interested in using some of these new surveys, just send me an email and I'm happy to set you up as a coordinator for our field testing site as well. You just have to have, you actually already have to be a coordinator on PBIS assessment, and then I can move it over for you. So let me share with you what it is. So these are a little bit different from school climate, where students just sort of rate, on a scale of 1 to 4 how you feel. These are ones that have got more open-ended questions and describe more specifically how students, and then we also have a family one, how students and families interact with their PBIS systems in schools. So what you see here is in the, what you've got at the top is a little bit of demographic information, so you can look at, you can disaggregate your responses by student group. And then what you see here down at the bottom, expectations, how your teachers want you to behave at school. So one question here, do you know how your teachers want you to behave at school? Yes or no? That question, believe it or not, is one of the strongest non-academic predictors of achievement in school. So the second thing you've got there is, what are the expectations? So you can actually go through and do a knowledge test on what the expectations are. That's an open-ended one. Are the expectations meaningful or important to you? If not, what do you think they ought to be? Are the expectations the same as they are in your home? If not, what's different? And it moves on to some other pages here. So there's some on acknowledgement, asking questions about how often you're rewarded or praised for following the expectations. And if so, are you rewarded in ways that are meaningful or important to you? For the elementary one, it just says in ways that you like. If not, how could it be more important? Questions about discipline, questions about safety, and especially on the online version, it actually lists out different locations in the school and asks students to report, what are the places in the school where I feel most safe? What are the places in the school I feel least safe? And you would be surprised how many students report that they feel very unsafe in bathrooms, and they actually don't eat or drink in the morning or throughout the day so that they can avoid going in the bathroom at all costs. And then start to think about, can those students who sort of have that hunger in their stomach and have a low-grade headache because they're not drinking enough throughout, whether you think they can actually pay attention to instruction? My guess is no. All right, some questions about respect, connections, and then a few open-ended questions at the end. One thing that teachers and staff at my school could do better to improve behavior is. One thing teachers and staff are doing in my school that they should keep doing is. And then this last one thing I wish my teachers knew about me is. All right, so like I said, you've got, you'll have on the handouts that we'll make sure are paired with this, the survey itself, but you can also get it if you're using PBIS assessment. Like I said, you can grab it on the field test site. So how likely are you to try that out? Look at that, we've already got a lot of people answering, wonderful. Make sure to chime in quick. I'm gonna do this quickly and then move on, so get your info out there. All right. Okay, people in the likely, very likely is slowly winning out. Now, next one, how likely do you think this would actually improve equity? One of the things that we think about is actually providing the scores back to staff to discuss, but also sharing some of those quotations of students so that staff can hear from students' voices how they're feeling, how they're relating to the behavior systems in the school. And that's one more way that you can have those conversations without trying to beat people over the head about it. All right, so getting in the likely, some people saying very likely. All right, thank you. All right, now moving to supportive environment. I might skip through a few of these slides because I'm going to assume that you've got some PBIS experience already. So hopefully you're all familiar with one of these, a school-wide expectations by settings matrix. Here's a high school one. where their school-wide expectations are compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence, or CARE. And then you've got each one of the columns down. So all settings, that's everywhere all the time: classroom, library, halls, cafeteria. Off-campus, assemblies and performances. A lot of schools are also adding online as another column in there. Thinking about settings where we have very few stated rules, very little instruction, and lots of modeling of bad behavior out there. Okay, so what are the reasons why we do this? We want to clarify for students, we want to clarify for staff. We want to cut down on miscommunication of our expectations and seeing unwanted behavior and assuming that's defiance as opposed to just they're doing it the way they thought that it was supposed to be done. It's a way to make the hidden curriculum visible, focus on positive, what to do as opposed to what not to do. Now, one of the challenges, I'm going to skip past these, but you'll have these, will be posted online. So you've got some examples out here. I'm going to assume that you know this. One thing that you can do, let's get back to this one real quickly, is take a look at your expectations matrix and ask yourself, are there specific examples? Are there overall expectations that might have some hidden biases in there? Are there ones that could be rewritten for more student-friendly language or be more student-centered, which was one of the things that you had all identified, or that some of you had identified as core parts of cultural responsiveness? Okay. Here's a really nice example from a school in Hampton, Virginia. They had a matrix before that they, if I'm remembering right, was a pretty generic one. And what they did is they said, you know, let's revise our matrix to make it meet the needs of our students and families and reflect them a little bit more. So what you can see is they've got 4 expectations here, and they spell out swag. So swag, if you're familiar with swag, thinking about swagger, being prideful about what you do. And they said, you know what, we can make that positive. That's not necessarily a negative thing, but if we could teach students to show swag for doing things the right way, doing things the pro-social way, that's awesome. And so you see safety first, work together respectfully, accept responsibility, and then look at that 4th one down there. That 4th one is guide me. That's what students can expect from the adults in the building to support them. All right, so I'm going to skip past a couple of these. I'm going to share with you a really cool activity that my friend Margriet in the Netherlands shared with me, and it's called a rules gallery walk. This is something that you would do particularly in high schools. Step 1 is have students walk around the school and document. Usually, you know, everyone's got a phone on them. Take a picture of any rule that they can find, okay? And then what you do is you go to a big open space like your gym. You post a picture of that rule that the students took and some flip chart paper below it. And you post a set of questions. Here's some example questions. You wouldn't necessarily do all of these. Is the rule positively stated? What's the purpose? What's the underlying value of that rule? Is this rule necessary? Does this rule fit within any one of our school-wide expectations? You know, could this fit underneath the language, the positive language of the school? And one of the things that you find is even a school that's doing PBIS really well might still have lots of signage and lots of rules around that are not related to the school expectations, that might reflect an underlying value of students do a lot of things that are really annoying and we need to cut it out so that they can actually learn, you know, which is not necessarily the value that we actually want to promote. And so then you take that and you revise your expectations or your specific examples or rules that you have in there. All right, so moving forward here, if you wouldn't mind rate. Now, some of you are not going to be working in high schools or with high schools, so you might have a lower score on this. But how likely would you be to try this out? Lots of likelies there. A few very unlikelies. Those are probably the ones that have a no cameras in school rule. right, just a couple more seconds and then we're going to move on to how likely do you think it would improve equity? All right, moving to the next question. We're going to go real quick. You only have 5 more seconds to answer this one. I want to get us out the door by the bell. Okay. Somewhere about 50-50 between likely and very likely, just a touch more. All right. So moving on, I wanted to identify for you another thing that many of you do, but I think we don't think about too often. So here's a study. Some of you have seen this, and you see the research on here. That's looking at, as you can see on the left side is baseline, and these are 3 different students in a middle school classroom, and the y-axis is percent of intervals on task, so lots of varying on-task behavior, and then an intervention that was very easy and very straightforward, and all it is 3 things. Teachers stood at the door to greet students on their way in. They used their name when they greeted them, and they directed them to an easy activity that they could start on their own before class really got going. And what you can see here is sort of flatlining or things getting a little worse during the baseline, and then things doing a little bit better after this really easy, straightforward thing to do to improve. So I'm going to move us past this one and skip this item here so we can get to some more. Many of you are probably already doing some of those. And also highlight the importance of recognizing students for doing the right thing. We do not want our wall of excellence award winners looking like this. Hopefully this was in September. All right. So here's an example of an acknowledgement slip. This is a nice one that shows connecting with families is really useful. This is actually a slip that my cousin got from her school, and her son, who is a smelly middle schooler who grunts a lot to her. And he did something really, really nice in the classroom that she had no idea he did, and wouldn't have had that conversation with him at home. He brought it home, she stuck it up on the fridge, and they had a great interaction with that. So that's a way to help engage parents in it that we think about. All right, so moving on, I want to get to one more. Here's in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, there's also a modified TFI walkthrough tool. So for those of you who are going through and doing the walkthrough where we interview staff and students, there's a little bit of a modified one that asks not just can students, do they know the expectations and have they been acknowledged, but can they describe those expectations in their own words? And can they describe where they are, what the specific settings are, and then making sure to sample by grade, by gender, by race or ethnicity, so we're not just getting some students, we want to get all students. Okay. Skipping through, I want to get to one more. We'll share with you, if you haven't been there and you're interested in what are some activities for enhancing not just tolerance, but embracing differences among students in your school. Great website, lots of free materials called Teaching Tolerance. Tolerance.org is the website if you look in this publications page. Here's one right here, 20 face-to-face advisories. Here's some lesson plans for what to do for discussions during advisory period, another high school one. Lots of great stuff there. Okay, so I'm going to share with you one more before we get out of here. And it's related to situational appropriateness, understanding that some behavior is okay in certain situations, is not problem behavior in some situations, but is unwanted in others. And there's this great activity. I'm going to skip this one. There's one called a pie chart that you can use that expands the standard T-chart. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through this one called a personal matrix for our last thing that we do. Personal matrix, sometimes called a behavior dictionary. This is a tool for understanding how often and the extent to which students have to move, change their behavior based on the particular situation. And I'm going to the easiest thing I think is just to show you what it looks like. Have you look at it, have you see how it fits, and then rate it. So this is an activity to do with students, not with the adults in the building. You can do it with the adults in the building too if you wanted to. So you got your school-wide expectations in the first column: be safe, be respectful, be responsible. And then you've got that next column, at school it looks like. That's probably going to be your all settings all the time category. Then you can see at home it looks like, and in my neighborhood it looks like, and those ones are left blank. The students fill those in on their own. That's why it's called a personal matrix. So here's an example of a filled in one. This student can write in perfect Comic Sans. Excellent penmanship. And you can look at that and you can get information about that particular student, but you can also look and you can say, gosh, you know, take a look at that second one under be safe. Tell an adult if there's a problem. That is something we often want students to do. But some students know that it may be at home, but in their neighborhood, for this student, that would be the thing to do to be completely unsafe at school. To look the other way is what's expected, instead of tell somebody. Keep your own business to yourself. So what you do is you can look at that, you can collect them from students, you can look at them and then hand them back to students because they can actually be a useful tool. And you ask yourself this question: where there are differences, ask the question, are those different rules necessary for positive student development? There are going to be some situations where we say, no, they're not. And we can actually change our school rules so that students have to jump the gap much less. But there are going to be some situations, because remember, everybody's personal matrix is different, that we're going to have to come up with school rules that are different than students' home or neighborhood environments. And we want to be really careful with that we don't label that behavior that they've identified at home and neighborhood as wrong or bad, but just that it's not for school. And when we do that, we know that they may practice it 18 hours a day outside of school a totally different way. So we've got to be really clear. Yeah, you might do this differently somewhere else, but at school, this is what we're hoping to have, and this is what we're looking to see, which means additional teaching, additional practice, and more acknowledgement. You can do that for specific expectations. So here's one that's done for independent seat work that you can see. What do you do at home? This is sort of the homework routine versus the school routine. What looks a little bit different? All right, and this is going to be our last set of questions here so we can finish on time. So take a look at the personal matrix. How likely are you to give it a try? Got a few people saying likely, a couple very, very likely, some unlikelies. One of the things to think about here is you're highlighting differences, and when we're saying we want you to do things differently at school, one of the things you want to be really careful of is that you're not devaluing where students are coming from or saying that what they're doing is wrong. A really nice, straightforward, easy way to change that, and it's something that Sandy Washburn taught me, is not to label those behaviors as wrong, but to label them as not for school. Okay, and then how likely do you think that would be to improve disciplinary equity? Our last question here. And while you do those ratings, I'm going to move past a few more strategies that are available here. So you could look at a strategy called VAB. We're not going to rate that. And then I'm going to do a little bit of plug for the disproportionality data guide, which walks through these 4-step problem-solving model. And end with contact information. Thank you all very much. These, the webinar video and the slides will be posted online. And please go ahead and identify something here and give it a try. Thank you for your time and continue to do good work out there.